As an African American male in these United States, and as a member of an all-black community, I notice many trends going around. You have the occasional pants sagging and the loud music, but the biggest trend, the most disturbing trend, is the trend of fear in the black community. The fear of police officers and law enforcement. A fear that 71% of African Americans who responded to a nationwide survey stated caused them stress. A fear of a group of civilians whose code of conduct states, as a law enforcement officer, my fundamental duty is to serve the community, to safeguard lives and property, to protect the innocent against deception, the weak against oppression or intimidation, the peaceful against violence or disorder, and to respect the constitutional rights of all to liberty, equality, and justice. Yet, when that area is a black community, there is a lack of protection. It is more prevalent that the police hurt the black community than protect it. It has gotten to the point where many sources, such as the New York Times, the Huffington Post, websites which keep daily accounts of police activity, state that African Americans are 3 times more likely to be killed by a police officer compared to Caucasians. And despite making up 13% of the population, we're 30% of those that are killed overall, while 21% of them are white. With this being said, there's no doubt that there's an air of untrust between the black community and law enforcement. And if charges are pressed for either use of excessive force or homicide, there's a 1% chance of conviction, according to several websites dedicated to logging the charges pressed against police officers and the outcome of said charges. This particular fear has only recently become an issue. Now, why is that? Why do police officers often get away with crimes that the other 99% of the population would quickly get convicted for? Now, there are several reasons for that. In a survey sent out to police departments by the Department of Justice, 61% of police officers stated that they do not report serious abuse done by a fellow officer. 52% of police officers said that it is not uncommon for officers to turn a blind eye to the improper conduct of others. So, if excessive force is seen by other officers, it is seldomly reported. But if it is reported and charges are pressed, there's a 1% chance that the officer is convicted. This is for 2 reasons. First, it's hard to determine whether excessive force is used. Now, let's talk about why that is. The primary reason that it's hard to convict on excessive force is because of an infamous ruling from a case called Tennessee versus Garner, which states that if an officer wishes to arrest a suspected criminal, they can use all the force necessary. And you may think, wow, that is insane. But that's not just it. There are rules to regulate the amount of force. The problem with that is that these rules are also vague and subjective. They state that an officer can use deadly force if it is necessary to prevent an escape, and if the officer has reason to believe that the escape will lead to others or themselves being harmed. This means that if one were to press charges against a police officer, it is entirely on the word of said officer, which poses a problem with themselves. I mean, who in their right mind would say something that would incriminate themselves? So anyhow, this fear that the police may kill a black person if they stop. How is this upheld? How does this fire burn so bright? Well, the simplest answer is the media. It is the constant headlines saying that there's been another black person killed and shot by the police. Not to mention that the internet is a 24/7 update of everything that's going on in the world. And with that said, it keeps the fear alive in the hearts of black folk around the world. Another fear that the black community has for the police is the fear of a wrongful arrest, or being arrested without probable cause. You see, of all of those that are wrongfully convicted, 70% of them are people of color, and 63% of them are black. The disparity of arrests between black people and white people can get as high as 10 times more. In certain areas of the country, the average is 3 times more, but that's the lowest it gets. You see, according to FBI records, the only places without such a disparity are places where black people don't live. Now, unlike the other fear, which has only recently become a problem, this fear has centuries of history behind it, dating all the way back to the 1800s, where there was such a thing as a slave patrol. The slave patrol's job was to retrieve, return, and punish runaway slaves. From there, the slave patrol devolved from a recognized organization to vigilante groups who made it their jobs to enforce that African Americans had less rights than their white counterparts and would punish blacks who dared to think otherwise. From there, the earliest police force started. They were tasked with protecting their respective areas and maintaining the separation between blacks and whites. It is from these groups that we get the current police force that we know. And it is also from these groups that the fear of wrongful conviction stems. So, what does the black community do? Well, they teach their children young how to act in front of a police officer when they're confronted. And they refuse to aid in the investigation of a police officer. Now, there are problems that come from this. First, in teaching their children fear the police, they're continuing the cycle of fear that's already rampant in the black community with kids. And by refusing to help in investigations, we continue the epidemic of black on black crime, which is not a nationwide epidemic, but a black one. It has been proven that you're more likely to be killed by members of your own race than members of other races. An example being black people, 90% of them are killed by other black people, and white people, 86% of them are killed by other white people. So with that being said, how does the black community get over their fear of law enforcement? And what would happen if they did? Well, I'm just going to go straight into what happens if we do get over our fear of law enforcement. Well, philosopher Dr. Cornel West said, once you break the back of fear and decide to stand up and join the brothers and sustain your resistance, with the help of social media and with the help of leadership and integrity that won't sell out, that's committed to the struggle, the justice more than just the personal gain, then you've got something. Then you've got a challenge to the person, to the status quo. Now that's what's needed right now, a change in the status quo. So how do we get there? How do we get over our fear of law enforcement? Well, the short answer is we don't. There's nothing that the black community can do to get over their fear of police officers. Why is that? Well, fear is induced by the presence of a threat, which your mind determines as an imminent harm. So the way to get over this is to either stand up to it or prove that there is no such threat. But in the case of the black community, there is a threat. So the second option, remove it. Go on, make it less threatening. You see, the police force has attempted to do this. They've attempted to do this with body cams and making sure that officers go with other officers. But body cams are seldomly used, and when they are used, the footage is manipulated by the media or the police force themselves. And in going with other officers, it doesn't prove to be so helpful since, as I said before, officers rarely report on others. So, what I propose is a series of steps that, if followed, will lower the apparent racial biases, shorten the gray area with excessive force, and make sure that officers are accountable for their actions. First, they have to include diversity and impartiality training in addition to the training that officers already receive. Now, lawyers are required to attend such training programs to ensure that in court they focus on the situation at hand and do not use their implicit racial biases to form a conclusion. Such skills would be useful in the police force because it would decrease the amount of unlawful arrests that occur due to the training in separating oneself from racial biases. Next, change the Tennessee v. Garner ruling. This ruling is too subjective and too broad to be applicable in today's society. The response that an officer should give to opposing force should always be proportional and strive to diffuse the situation in such a way that both parties are safe. Therefore, it should be changed to include specific situations and what should transpire in such situations. And finally, strip the power of police officers who are charged with murder. Now, what do I mean by charged with murder? I mean, it is proven that this is a wrongful death. I mean, officers should not keep their titles throughout the investigative process because it is too apparent that the power that the title law enforcement officer grants provides bias and misconduct of evidence. In addition to stripping the power of the perpetrator, the case has to be taken up by the police one district over. This is to ensure impartiality and decrease the possibility that connections within the police force lead to a lack of convictions. If these 3 steps are taken, then the amount of black people stopped and killed by the police should drastically decrease. And in turn, the fear that the black community has for the police should decrease and eventually die away. Thank you.